Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Welcome to Next Economy Now podcast. My name is Erin Axelrod, and I'm a partner worker owner at Lyft Economy. And I am joined today by Ro Horton, the co-founder of the UNtraining, which he co-founded with Rita Shimon and his co-director Janet Carter. Ro has been practicing undoing racism and working with Rita Shimon since 1994, studying her approach to multidimensionality, which she calls racism, diversity, and risk of the self. The UNtraining is based on their work together, and Ro has also been practicing Tibetan Buddhism for more than 30 years. I'm also joined by Swan, who is a psychotherapist, consultant, and racial justice educator dedicated to dismantling white supremacy and other forms of oppression. She has been engaged with the UNtraining since 1997 and has taught all levels of the UNtraining, helped develop UNtraining curriculum, and trained new teachers. She delivers workshops nationally, addressing intersecting social oppressions at colleges, universities, spiritual programs, and other institutions, and has developed and delivered programs for government leaders, police chiefs, and officers. She is the senior teacher for Phase 1 and Phase 2 groups in New England and facilitates Phase 3 online. You can learn more at her website, Unlearning Oppression, or you can learn more at the UNtraining website as well. Without further ado, Swan and Ro, welcome to the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now podcast. My name is Erin Axelrod. I'm a partner worker owner at Lyft Economy, and I'm so pleased today to be joined by Ro and Swan. They are collaborators at the UNtraining. And Ro, I would love to start off with you sharing a little bit about your journey to this work. And welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleased to be here. It's always an interesting question. Where does the story start? I think I will add one. Don't think I've ever mentioned before. I was in the 6th grade and I read a biography of George Washington Carver, African-American biologist. And I was so struck in that book by the racism that I think that was the first time where I became, as a young person, really aware of racism. So then I'll jump to, I got involved with process-oriented psychology through health issues, actually. And it's a way of looking at your experience and drawing meaning from body symptoms. That's one of its more effective things. And it also attempted to work with world issues and with differing results. But nevertheless, I went to this training program that lasted 3 months. And it was there that I met my teacher and mentor, Rita Shimon, who is a African-American Filipino woman. And we were gathered there was quite a bit of diversity in the group. I mean, there were people from 15 different countries. There were 85 people and just a lot of diversity. I mean, there were, like my roommates, for instance, one was from India, but they were an untouchable. And it's very difficult for untouchables to travel in the world. And they were a doctor. And as a doctor, they could only treat untouchables. And just something that's not that well known, so I'd like to say it, is that the population of untouchables in India is larger than the entire population of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And these are some of the most oppressed people in the world. And then my other roommate was a Baptist minister from Oakland, African American. And I met Rita there, and although we were ostensibly there to study process work, we ended up working on racism most of the time because it was so thick that you couldn't ignore it. And so that was like really good. But there was this one process one day where racism was being worked on. And actually my roommate said very strongly after the process, he's going, well, that was really good. But if we have to work with every white person like we just did, well, he said it real personally. He said, if I have to work with every white person like we just did, it's going to kill me. And he said, why don't white people get together and work on this themselves? And I was sitting next to Rita, and I turned to Rita and said, yeah, why don't they? Why doesn't somebody do that? And there was this long pause where she just raised her eyebrow. I call it the eternity eyebrow moment, because it seemed like it was a long time. I'm sure, it wasn't as long as it felt. And then she said, why don't you? So that was really the beginning. And then after that whole program was over, it was a 6-week program. Came back to the Bay Area. Rita also lived in the Bay Area. And we continued to be in touch and work together. And Rita had unique approaches to things. Like, she didn't really work with me, with the nuts and bolts of racism. I got that from other folks. But she worked with me with the way of holding it, with a sense of love. And then the next thing that happened was I had a dream. And in the dream, I had started a white group to work on this. And in the morning when I got up, I wrote down the names of the people in the group, and I called them up. And all but one said, yes, I'd love to do that. That one person ended up doing the UNtraining later, but they weren't available at the time. And then probably the only other thing to say was then I worked developing. That was like a real experimental period. And I came to Rita and I said, probably another 9 months and I'd be ready to work with the public. This was back in 1994, I should say. And her response to that was, no, you're ready now. And I just worked with this group and I told them their next step was to work with you. So here are their names. Call them. So that's literally how I came to be doing the UNtraining.
And we'll get into it in a moment, because I'm sure our listeners are waiting to find out more. What is this UNtraining? But Swan, what was your journey into this work?
Well, I grew up in a spiritual commune in the woods of Western Massachusetts, in a very rural white area, and where we were taught very little about racial difference and racism. In school, we studied a little bit of slavery. We studied a little bit about the civil rights movement. But the way that racism was always discussed was as something that was kind of some other people elsewhere, like something that happened in the South, something historical, something that was not about us because we were good people. So when I moved to Oakland, halfway through college, I ended up moving from Bennington, Vermont to Oakland, and for the first time really being in a very multicultural environment. And for the first time being in an environment where people were really discussing race and racism. I had grown up with some political education around class and classism and economic structures. My stepfather was a historian, and I was an activist as a young person and also had a Buddhist practice from the age of 16. But somehow racism had never really been something that was presented to me as something that really had anything to do with me. And then I am about 20, and all of a sudden I'm in school in Oakland, or 21. And I'm in classes at Mills College, and we're talking about race and racism. I specifically sought out a class to study, And I realized that I had no idea what we were talking about a lot of the time. It was a mixed graduate class, and it was very intellectual. And so we were reading these books and we were talking from a very intellectual, dry kind of standpoint, analyzing the books, analyzing the authors, what their intent was this stereotype, was this racist, was this not? And the class it had a very tense environment in it. It was like we were skirting around issues. And at one point I realized like I really didn't understand what we were talking about. And I decided I was going to risk saying that. And so I did. I spoke up and said, I really actually don't understand this stuff. I have stereotypes of every group and I don't really know which ones are bad, which ones are good, what makes a stereotype bad. Like I had these really elementary questions. And I said, I have stereotypes of Irish. I have stereotypes of, and I started to just say I have all these stereotypes. And a woman who appeared to me to be white slammed down her book and said, I don't have to listen to this shit. And she got up and she walked out of the class and the class just went silent. And I remember that moment. I remember the feeling in my body of like, I just did something wrong. I don't know what, but I know I just did something really wrong and I guess must be racist. And the teacher said, okay, everybody notice what you're feeling and I'll see you next week. And we were near the end of class. Class just ended and we left in this state of tension. And as I was walking back up to my dorm, there were two other undergraduate women who also appeared to be white. And they came up to me and said, I don't know what was wrong there. We had the same questions. And so then I moved from a state of feeling worried that I'd done something and maybe, I would say fearful, to a state of, wait a second, then if they had the same questions, then these must be okay questions. And I started moving into a state of sort of self-righteousness. And I had an appointment to talk to the teacher. And by the time I went in to see her, I was feeling like I'd been wronged. I went in going, I thought this was a safe environment to ask questions and to learn. And she said, safe for whom? And it struck me that I'd never thought about the fact that that I had questions could mean that I was creating an unsafe environment for anyone else. And I was curious, like, what does that mean? And she said that the woman who had slammed down her books was Armenian and was doing her graduate work on the Armenian genocide, which I had never heard of. In my schooling, I had never heard that over 1 million people were slaughtered in Turkey in a massacre that's never been dealt with. And that I got, okay, so for her, if that's her background and her history, and she's working on the literal annihilation of a people based on stereotypes and based on the isms, and here is someone coming in who just wants to explore for the first time, it wasn't creating an environment that she wanted to be in. It wasn't what she was there for, and it didn't make her feel safe. So then I was in a quandary because I do have these questions and I do want to learn. And if I can't do it in school, where do I do that? And if it's not okay to do in a mixed race room, because also in this class, it was about 40% people of color in the class. And we never did have a conversation about this. We went on with the class on an intellectual level after this. And the teacher also was a white woman who was nervous in the class. She said she was getting knots in her stomach each time this class was happening. So being in a mixed race room to try to explore this clearly was not going to be the most helpful process to the group. So my partner at the time found a flyer at a public library in Berkeley, and it was for the UNtraining. And it said Untraining White Liberal Racism. And it was specifically a caucus group for white people, which is exactly what I needed. And I called up Ro and we talked for a couple hours, and it was deep. And it was really clear that this is where I could start to explore those issues of what is racism? What does it mean to be white in this society? And it was also clear that we were going to be able to go in depth on political levels, on spiritual, on personal, on emotional, on intellectual. We were, with one of the things I really loved about Ro and about this approach is it really is comprehensive. It wasn't like, here's a history, it wasn't what you can get out of a book or a standard class. It was like, this is going to be a deep dive that we're going to all be doing together. And that was in 1997. And I have been with the UNtraining ever since then, first as a student, and after a few years, as the program grew, it was clear that we needed to have some additional teachers. So I was one of the first 3 assistant teachers, and have been with the program till now. And I train the teachers with Ro and with a couple of other senior mentor teachers. And I would say it's become my spiritual practice. I'm also a therapist. So I use this in the process of doing the UNtraining. I went and got my therapy training and realized that the whole field of psychology in the United States and Europe is based on a Euro-American model of health, and realized that the training programs don't address that. They're woefully unprepared because it takes a long time. It takes a long time of really exploring the self from a cultural lens to begin to see how we're culturally programmed, and then to begin to undo that programming.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing, both of you, your journeys. I'm wondering, Ro, if you could share a little bit. Swan started dipping into what the UNtraining is and what it feels and tastes like. Could you share a little bit more? You have 5 minutes in an elevator. How do you share with people what the UNtraining is and all its complexity?
Wow, it's 5 minutes in an elevator. Let's see. Well, I guess if there's one thing that would have to be that we try to create a space of basic goodness, which is not good versus bad, but a sort of unconditioned space that has the human, some sense of human decency, from which you can begin an exploration of how you've been programmed or conditioned. So when you find that conditioning, if you just use that to beat yourself up as an individual, then that renders you pretty useless for any social activism or even relating to people. The very first thing is to create that space for an exploration to happen. And then the next thing I would probably say to somebody is like, every single white person is conditioned. It's like breathing smog in a city, which is actually an image that Beverly Daniel Tatum uses. You can't avoid it, and you don't know. Like when you breathe in smog, you don't know usually that you've breathed in smog, and yet you have, and it's affecting your body. And likewise, the conditioning is like that. Like I grew up in Quincy, Massachusetts, which at the time, I hear it's different now, but at the time was a northern racist community. By that, northeastern. I remember challenging and asking my parents, why aren't there any black people in Quincy? And my parents just like that said, it wasn't an answer they had to search for. It's like it was like at the top of their consciousness. It's like, oh, the real estate agents keep them out. It's like, oh, my parents who see themselves as good people know this, like at the top of their consciousness, not buried anywhere. And yet that was sort of like as the norm. I try to get people off the question of am I racist or not by just getting them to the place that by the nature of being white, you have the conditioning. There is a difference between the conditioning and you have a choice to look at that conditioning, to work with it, to counter it, or not. And the or not becomes like we use this image of which we also took from Beverly Daniel Tatum, of the moving sidewalk, where, those moving sidewalks at the airport. Well, if you're, in order to be an anti-racist, you have to turn around and walk the other way, which takes a lot of effort. And if you're just not, quote unquote, I'm not doing anything, standing, then the elevator's moving you along and supporting the racism. And then there's folks who add their energy to it, whether it's through, economic planning or whether the more cliched version of a racist.
I would add that the UNtraining, there are different programs. So there's a program for white people, which is the largest of the programs. There's also an UNtraining program for people of color. And there has been a program for people of Chinese descent. And that was by request of a group of people coming in saying, we really want to look at this. We want to look at how whiteness affects us, and as well as looking at internalized oppression. So the program that Ro and I focus on is primarily the Untraining White Liberal Racism. And I remember when I used to say that name of that program, people would get, as white people in particular, would get a little irked, a little agitated just to hear the name, which has changed. Most of the time now when I say, we have a program called Untraining White Liberal Racism, I have the experience of white people kind of leaning in. And white people from a pretty broad spectrum of politics, actually. Sometimes conservatives are really thrilled to hear that we're working. Yes, liberals are racist too. You like to point your fingers, but so we do work specifically with people who identify as liberal or progressive or leftist, who want to understand how we are conditioned. Those of us who would not want to participate in a racist system, we want to understand, this program helps us understand how we are programmed to contribute to that system even when we don't want to. So how to uncover what now you hear a lot of talk about unconscious bias. There wasn't a lot of talk about that in 1997 in white communities. This is relatively new that it's really widely talked about, which is great. This program is different from many of the others that I've participated in or even presented or taught with, in that we take the time. It's a 6-month program for the phase 1. We take the time to go in depth into the psyche and look at how that conditioning impacts us in order to become more effective out in the world in interrupting racism. So we look at ourselves as a way of looking outside and understanding the world. And it's done in a series of, so there's a phase 1, that's 6 months. Then there is a second year, which is a phase 2, going deeper into it, looking at how we do conflict, how we have learned to cap our emotions and our expression, and how we can work with a broader range of emotions. And that's really important with racism in particular, because when racism comes up in society, it tends to be pretty explosive. And if we have not looked at our own conditioning, and if we're not used to dealing with intense emotion, often we may shut down as white folks, and we might want to shut down the conversation. And we might say things like, I can't listen to you when you're angry like that. Or if a person of color is bringing up racism in the workplace, we might say that's kind of her issue, rather than getting that this is something that we're all conditioned by. Also, wanted to note that Ro was talking about white conditioning and how we take this in, like the smog we breathe. Also, all people in a white-dominated society take in that conditioning, and it impacts us in different ways. And so we work in caucus because there are different ways that people of color take in this programming and different harm that it does in specific ways than with white folks. And we also recognize that there's a pretty broad spectrum of whiteness, that not all white people are the same. I have a Jewish mother coming from Ukraine. I have a Christian English father. Whiteness looks very different in those two communities. And training has been incredible for me to be able to explore that and really understand my own racial conditioning from two separate backgrounds and learn what parts of myself I've learned to shut down to be white.
I would add one thing to that was like, when a person of color is taking in the white conditioning and it becomes internalized oppression, it's a very different way to working, because those conditionings are keeping them down, whether they're coming from outside or inside. Whereas for white people, the conditioning is keeping us one up, like, in a dominant position, so that the work is very, very different.
I think one of the tricky things with that too, and one of the resistances that often white people have to seeing racism, is that we don't feel one up. A lot of times it's like, sometimes you'll have a group of white people get together in the room, and pretty soon it almost feels like nobody's white because one is poor and one is, people, we're oppressed on different levels. So it can be oppressed on an economic level, or I can be targeted because of my gender or my sexual orientation. So there's all of these intersecting isms that can make it hard to look at that white conditioning. And one of the things that I appreciate about this program is that we can acknowledge and look at those other isms and keep bringing the focus back to, wait, it's like, what does it mean to be in this category, this made up thing called white that comes with some social power? How do we begin to really recognize that?
And how can we use our other experiences that Swan just named, where we're like, if we're poor, or if, we're Jewish, or being a woman or queer, how can we look at take our experience of being targeted and use that to empathize with the situation of racism, so that nothing is thrown out, everything is used? Like, if you have an experience of being targeted as a white person, some other ism, then you can actually use that to understand, oh, I felt this, and this is so much bigger, and it's been going on for, hundreds of years. You can use it as a way in.
And to use that as fuel, energy source to walk the other way on the walkway. You have both been transformed by this work personally, and I'm curious if you would be willing to share in what ways.
So, growing up with a Jewish mother of Ukrainian descent, a little bit of Polish and German in there too, and a father of English Protestant descent, the two sides of my family were very, very different. And my father's side was like the side that I'd see on TV. And they were normal. They were the normal white Americans. I grew up on a hippie commune. I was quite embarrassed of this. I knew that we were different. It was 300 people on 80 acres of land trying to live off, move off the grid and live a spiritual lifestyle. But I knew that that we were not normal. And I went to a regular public school and I wanted to be like the normal kids. I hadn't thought about it in racial terms, but I knew that I was trying hard to fit in a society that I didn't really fit in. I was also aware, without thinking again in racial or cultural terms, that my mother's side didn't fit in. My mother came from a middle-class background, and being Jewish, on her side, it meant being quite intense, more intense than my father's side, more expressive, more emotional, more political, more sexual, more just the emotional and intellectual volume and energetic volume was higher on her side than my father's. And I found myself unconsciously trying to make her smaller, so that she could fit in. And I realized that it took me a couple of years in the UNtraining to really begin to see how I was making myself smaller to try to fit in with quote unquote normal society, which was a racialized white society. In my father's culture, the intensity cap is very low. You don't really show a lot of emotion. You don't raise your voice. You keep things very even keel and very professional. And it took me a little while to realize, professional meant leave most of myself at the door. And if I have learned to leave most of myself at the door to be acceptable and palatable to mainstream culture, I sure as hell am going to try to shut other people down and help them conform. Same as like when you're in kindergarten and you learn to stand in line, you can get very invested in making sure that everybody else stands in line, right? So as I started to see this and understand my cultural conditioning, I started allowing myself to be bigger. I started freeing up parts of my emotional body, parts of my spirit, parts of my expression. And in doing so, I could handle way more intensity from others. So naturally, without necessarily trying, my relationships with other people of different cultures became much easier, much richer. And I felt like I became more real. And one of the things I love in the UNtraining is that they weren't trying to train me to be like anybody else. No one was trying to train me to be like Ro or be like Rita or say the right thing or get the right language. In fact, it was pretty much getting out of that. It was getting out of the idea that there's a right way to be, because that's part of the white training, that there is a right way to be. we're even trained to view like there's a right way to feel, to look, to think. Even our bodies within this white cultural conditioning, even our bodies, there's a right way for them to look. It's like everything has a box that you have to fit into. And so as I started really examining that, I started having some freedom from those boxes. And that was huge and hugely liberating. And so instead of trying to make me like someone else, it was more like, be more you. Get bigger, allow yourself to be bigger so we can have more impact on the world. Because when we're locked into these little boxes, on a psychological level, part of what white conditioning does also is it makes you always feel like there's something wrong with you. Because there is a right way to be and you will never be it. So we become, everything within this training also becomes the cultural conditioning is like everything is a product. You're separate from land. Land can be bought or sold and owned. Your body can be a product that is either the right size or shape or not. And really, you talk to supermodels, nobody ever actually achieves whatever this mythical ideal is. So I guess the cultural conditioning is you're always chasing after something that you're not, which keeps you insecure, which makes sure that you will never be a powerful agent for change, and you'll never really be able to seriously align with other people in any sustainable way. So the UNtraining has liberated me tremendously in those areas.
Mm. I was actually like, when you asked the question, I felt like the change was so deep that I didn't even know how to speak about it. But the first thing that came after hearing Swan speak was Rita a long time ago. She hasn't done this in a while. She used to start when she was working with a group she'd come in and she'd say, what if everything that you've been taught is a lie? What would that mean? And then, she pulled out a map. First, a Mercator map, which is the map most of us grew up with in geography class. And then a map, which I'm forgetting the name of, but it shows the actual
or the Peters
size.
Projection?
Do you know that, Erin?
Dymaxium map from...
Yeah, the Peters Projection. Yeah, so it shows the actual size of the continents. And it's mind-boggling because you realize that the Mercator map reflects basically European and by extension, American view of themselves and is not a real view of the world. So I feel like the change, because, I grew up I'm at a pause. It's still such a big question because almost everything has changed. So it's hard to calculate the transformation in a way. But applying that, what if everything you've learned is a lie? I basically applied that to all different aspects of my experience. I'm a meditator, a Buddhist meditator, and that has helped me explore and to extend that investigation of what if everything I've been taught is a lie. One of the UNtraining tools, we call tracking, which is like a fundamental change, is I track all the time now. And I'll explain what tracking is. Tracking is just when you enter a situation, is just looking at, in any situation, what isms are present, what's being activated in you as you're walking into environments with the isms, noticing how the programming comes up to keep you in line, and then noticing at choice points where you could do something different. I would say I'm a part of it has changed my consciousness. And that's why it's actually hard to talk about and it's also every issue, we're all facing like a huge change because of, global warming and the climate, and just viewing that or getting that. Like I remember going, when I was still learning process work, going to a conference in Watsonville, a process work conference, which was supposedly on Latino issues. But it quickly polarized into a group of white people from Santa Cruz who were environmentalists and the Latino people, so that there was this polarization between working on the environment and working on the environment in which people of color lived. And it really wasn't about the issue. It was more about the white people like being in control of the environmental issue and not seeing how the two were related. And now, in this time and space that we're in this moment right now, the two cannot be separated, because the people who are going to be feeling the strongest effects of climate change will be people of color and poor people. So, in a way, this is sort of holistic view of how all the isms and how we treat the earth come together, rather than being these things that are like separate issues. I think I would like to say that, some Native American traditions, like I'm really into an Iroquois shaman named Mad Bear, who talked about the period that we're in now and will be in for some time as the transition. He said it's a time of great change, great strife, and the only way through is to embrace the transition. And the sense is that, to me, that means working together and beginning to value the land in a way that white people in particular have not done. European culture has not done.
Maybe since the Industrial Revolution, yeah?
Or even before. I think it's really hasn't been in Western culture since tribal times. I think it was there originally, but originally is way back.
Ro, as you were talking, I was thinking about your role in the UNtraining. So most of your role in the UNtraining is holding and guiding these groups of people, now hundreds of people that you've done. So the transformation, there's the individual level within yourself, but there's a transformation that you have held for lots of us. So the transformation that's happened has really been a shift in these communities and in society. The conversation has shifted so much since you began the UNtraining to where society is now. Some things I know you say have gotten better, and some things I know you say have not gotten better, right? And we hear a lot from different communities about what what's shifting, and not all progress.
Can I say one thing? That actually helped me come up with a much more succinct answer. I have shifted from like working in myself to just how can I hold space in a multidimensional way that's more than realities, and how can I get bigger and bigger to just be there for a group to begin and extend that exploration.
That's key. I will say that one of the things that I would say one of the concepts that is most central to me and has been the most beneficial in my work with other people is this idea of multidimensional consciousness. And Ro and Rita have been teaching this for a long time in a way that is like you keep making room for more and more. So you see so much of society right now polarized on everything. It's like, which side are you on, right? You're either with us, you're against us, you're either right or you're wrong, right or left. It's like the more polarization that I see out there, the more I appreciate what's happening in the UNtraining is a constant focus on holding more than one reality at a time. In fact, I would say our core practice within the UNtraining is how do we hold more than one reality at a time? Ro was mentioning basic goodness. How do you hold an awareness of your basic goodness and the basic goodness of whoever it is that you're talking to at the moment, while also being able to hold the isms that are present, and while also being able to hold the oppressive parts of oneself and society. So what this does is it takes us easily out of good guy, bad guy. It takes us out of that rut that people can get in trying to figure out is what they said or what I said racist or not. And we can get so caught up in, was there racist intent? Was there not, into a space of like, okay, conditioning exists. All the isms are there. I have basic goodness. I have some training that can get in my way. I'm not a bad person. If somebody else does something that is oppressive, it doesn't make them a bad person. It means that there's something that really needs to be addressed. Can we work on this together? Can we look at this together? Can we hold more than one reality at a time so that we can form alliances with people we agree with and people we don't, people who look like us, people who don't, people of many different backgrounds, to actually move towards what are our common goals? Because on a basic human level, I think that most human beings have pretty shared goals and pretty much shared needs. We want to be safe. We want our children to be safe. We want to feel respected. We want to have, we want food. We want access to resources. We want to be able to live well. So how do we, and if we don't come together across difference, I don't think we have too much of a shot as a species of survival right now. Where things are headed on the planet, we're going to have to learn to work together as humans to shift how we live and how we make use of these resources. And I think sometimes with anti-racism work, there can be a misunderstanding that this work is about making white people feel shame or self-blame and try to fix it and try to make up for it. And this is a totally different game than that. Really, this is about, can you acknowledge who you are, where you are in the world, and what you need, and how do we use our focus together collectively to understand the system and our role in it so we can shift it. One more thing I want to mention is, Ro, as a musician, the way you work with music also is a big part of who you are. As a teacher, one of the things that makes the UNtraining different is that you and Rita both are such unique individuals. You come to this work and bringing all of these different aspects of self so that this can never just become an intellectual pursuit. This is not a class, again, in understanding just the history so we can fix this, or understanding the right language so we don't offend, or anything prescripted. You come from a very fluid state of being and a fluid consciousness, as does Rita, that is highly unusual. So part of how we're different is just how we are with each other, how we move through the world and becoming more multidimensional. So we hold the political realities, we hold the personal. Part of that tracking that Ro mentioned is we really analyze situations from like what's happening on a personal level, what's happening on the relationship level here, what's happening on the group level, what's happening with the isms. So we're holding all these different realities and getting really skilled in being able to hold that at once so that we can move with greater freedom, especially in our racial justice work.
And here we are with the constructs of time. Oh, thank you for all you've shared, both of you. My interest in this work has gotten piqued even more. And as we bring this never-ending conversation to a pause point for today, I'm curious if there's other things you would like to leave our listeners with, other tidbits or thoughts, not as a close, but as I have a friend recently who's been using the word clopening.
Well, I think I would like to provide ways for people to connect with us, which is our website is www.untraining.org, and we have 2 new beginning groups that are opening in January. We'll also be having an online open house in the near future. So where people can come and ask us questions and learn more.
We have a lot of
really
wonderful, skilled, experienced teachers who are also happy to answer people's questions. So if people email us, when people call the UNtraining, there are a lot of people who would reach back. One thing that's coming up for me at the moment, so I'm just going to share it, is that as a therapist, I think a lot of the things that we deal with in this field, a lot of the anxiety and depression that we see rampant in our society, these tools that we work with in the UNtraining, they are antidotes. That's something that I hold, and that I feel that the healing of the undoing of these social conditionings creates better mental health. And a lot of that also has to happen through community. So even though you can study anti-racism on your own, you can read your books, you can watch videos, which is really important. Anyone who engages in this work, it's really important to find community and work together, and having something that's a shared cause where we are healing and growing together is crucial.
That brings me to a quote of Rita's. If you try to do this on your own, alone, you'll go crazy, because it's a societal problem, so it has to be addressed as a community.
Thank you, Ro, for helping build this massive community that's been going so strong. We have people in the UNtraining who've been in for over 25 years together now. It's powerful. It's powerful to have a group of people who really tell the truth together and really support each other and really challenge each other in a very loving way.
Thank you, Swan, for helping to grow the UNtraining through ways that I wouldn't have even been able to imagine.
Thank you, Erin.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention on this podcast that I personally have been transformed by my experiences through each of the phases. And I really, one thing I so appreciate in how the UNtraining is held is, the discontinuation of the myth that there's a starting and stopping point, and that these phases, phase 3 is taken infinitely. And that community, Swan, you just mentioned, is absolutely, has been just transformational in so many ways to really get out of that conditioning of the individual mindset around being able to trick our minds into believing that we can fix things on the individual level. May our listeners be inspired and intrigued to learn more and find that community of UNtraining wherever it is, whether it's through the UNtraining program or in other ways that we unlearn together.
And may we all stay beginners in the work, because the last thing we need now is a bunch of people running around saying, now we're experts in whiteness. It doesn't work that way. We're beginners. Always. This is an exploration that is a lifelong exploration, like any spiritual path. You never get to a space in your meditation where now I got it. Now I'm done. Now I'm there. Now let me tell you how to do it. No, it's more how can we continue to learn and grow together and heal.
Yeah, someone once asked me, how do you know if a teacher's real? Because we were discussing somebody that we knew that announced that they had got it. And I just said, well, the people who end up getting it don't go around saying, I got it.
Thank you so much. We'll maybe need to have a podcast too.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.